All right, recording.
Okay. I assume it's already recording, so without further ado, let's call upon the Prime Minister. You're here. Speakers, please let us know what's your preferred POI method, yeah.
Hello, am I audible?
You are. Turn on your camera while you're speaking, unless you are not consented to.
I guess I cannot turn on my camera. Just my connection was kind of.
Sure.
Okay. For those of you who want to POI, just unmute yourself. I'm not gonna read the chat box. Let me set up my timer. I'm gonna start my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. What's the interest as a progressive movement? We say that as progressive movement, what we want, of course, like to give more progressive value. They say equality and progressive in free from oppression and all of that. The problem of this is that much of this are countered by this certain anti-progressive institution. We say military force, we say police institution, they do this certain police shooting, racial profiling, and all of that constantly happens every day. And much of party that vote for this anti-progressive that regress our movement. We say that as progressive movement, we think that this debate should talking about whether or not that we should support our member if they choose to go to certain anti-progressive institution. They say we don't force this member to not going there a certain anti-institution, but what we say that as progressive movement we have the right to discourage the certain member, given that it principally wrong, given that it principally already harms our movement for far too long. We think that it's right. So as OG, we think that we're going to discourage our members in entering the certain anti-progressive institutions such as U.S. police, or if they want to go to Republican Party that always vote for anti-conservative value that anti with our movement. We think that these are going to be right. So what I'm going to prove to you, 3 things to say. First, I'm going to prove to you why it's principally wrong that this anti-institution already did to us. And secondly, why that internal reform won't likely happen, since I believe that opposition might say, oh, we can do certain internal reforms by joining this anti-institution. I'm going to prove that why it won't likely, but thirdly, I'm going to give you the comparative. First arguments, why it's principally wrong. I think that you need to take a look how does the awful things that all these anti-institution done. There are 2 things to say. First, we say that this anti-institution movement or they regress our movement. They should say that the more often that our movement and protests, such as how we protest regarding LGBT more awareness, or how we protest for like Black Lives Matter currently, we say that there are much of them are being simply just shut out by this anti-institution. They should say that police are going to kidnap our members or do this certain oppression under the name of that this institution have the roles to this to have the obligation or have the interest to do this kind of thing. We think that much of our movement in a way where that we want to give more like when we want to voice out our opinions, we want to voice out our grievances, but oftentimes we're going to be shut out by this anti-institution, and of how much they do certain like racial profiling that that discourage our member to join to the protest because they scared about this intensive force from this anti-institution. We think that this is what much of the time are set back our members to get much further impact on our movement because they are much counter from this anti-institution. We think that it's awful for us to simply just support this anti-institution that triggers our movement because our interest to have more progressive movement at the end of the day. The second thing what's more awful is that they create systematic disenfranchisement. They should say like political parties like Republican vote for certain conservative value that having disenfranchisement or disadvantage to our groups. They say like things like gerrymandering that disadvantage voter for like black people, or they vote for certain policy that disadvantage LGBT group to cannot express themselves, and all of others like policy that happens in Congress that enact in real life. We think that much of the times is voted by this institution, which is that how they hamper our political party like Democrats to voting more progressive value. We think that this is what awful things that they've done. So it's principally wrong in the moment when all of this hampering that they done to us, and we simply just support to them because we think that the moment when you support the moment when you join and part of this anti-institution, it means that you principally support and consent to join all of these forces or policy that they enact. You mean that you support your brother or sister member from your progressive movement to being disenfranchised by this movement. So that's why that in principle we think that they shouldn't in line with this oppression. But secondly, we think why internal reform won't likely happens, because if opposition wants to say that I think it's justified because in the moment when you enter you can like change all of it. We think that won't simply happen. Like two things to say. First, we say that they are leader decision making. They should say that much of the time, the reason why like much of black people inside police, but they cannot change the police to become more like progressive or like conservative Republican. There are black people in Republican Party is that they don't have the capability to create those big decision making of the institute, because much of the time we characterize is that they have the small percentage, and secondly that much of the time these leader institution comes from the conservative or the anti-progressive actor. They say so like in the moment even if like you join, you cannot simply give the certain like decision making to change police to be defunded or like change like Republican Party to simply just become passing policy that favor to LGBT and all of that, because they are like the decision making is on top of the leader. But secondly, we think that there are constant interest. So, for example, like Republican Party have a constant interest to pander to voter base that vote for conservative value. So we think that I don't see the significance why like simply like conservative party would simply change, because they have much more voter base that they better pander to rather than this small member from progressive value, that progressive member inside their party. So we think that the likelihood to simply change is very hard and very long way to go. But thirdly, why the comparative in our side? We think that in our side we don't conflict interest to solidify our movement. They should say like in our movement, in the moment when we want to defund police or to create anti-police, but we have the certain our sister and member is on this anti-institution that we cannot simply just like defend the police and it triggers our movement, or simply in the moment when we want to like to really oppose to conservative party, but the moment when we saw that there are much of our member also that fight for this conservative value. So we think that we want to solidify and just unify in our movement as progressive. We're very proud to open the case of OG.
All right, thank you so much, Prime Minister. So now let's call upon the leader of opposition here. You are now.
If there's any POI, just unmute, okay? Okay, wait a second. I'm going to start with 3, 2, 1. Panels here in opening opposition. What we want is we want to enlarge the movement, and we want progress right in our side of the house. Ladies and gentlemen, we say the opening government only playing on the safest side, or they only playing on the best case scenario, and assuming that everyone in the progressive institution is everyone is non-progressive, and they don't actually characterize people in the gray area. Well, here in the opening opposition, we're going to give you the character of progressive movement, right? Our interest is we want to broaden the spectrum of the movement, and we want to enlarge the movement. So we need to engage with many people as possible, right? And now in the status quo, there are a lot of people who actually support our movement, ladies and gentlemen. And also, the characterization of anti-progressive institutions is that they're more likely want just to say traditional, right? And they don't necessarily want progress. But this is actually the kinds of institution who have power, the kind of institution who can create policy, like for example, like for Republican Party or etc. And also, like we all need to actually acknowledge that not everybody in those type of area is actually conservative. There's a lot of people in the gray area, and those type of people who more likely who listen to our those are the type of people who are more likely to listen to our values, or want to listen on what we have to offer, right? But before moving on to my argument, ladies and gentlemen, several vote for the opening government side of the house. The opening government side of the mount claim to you that they want to voice out their opinion. But we say this is exactly why we should engage with them. We should engage to this anti-progressive institution, because we want our voices to be heard, especially by the people who actually don't believe in our movement, right? We want them to change. We want them to shift. We want them to actually see the value of our movement. And also, they claim to you that this is going to harm the systematic value, or like disadvantage the further and etc. But we say this is why we say in our side of the house this will change. They will explain later in my argument. Also, they also claim to you that something in our side those systematic change cannot just simply change, right? But we say to you this is much better in our side of the house, because we say it's much better to go with the long run rather than rather than not engage with them at all, and thus changes won't happen in their side of the house. And we say even if, like, say, the Republican Party won 100% change, at least now with this movement going inside of their party and etc. At least now they have the policy that would benefit our movement. And also currently this progressive movement, there's a lot of people who supporting, and anti-progressive movement there's a claim have a lot of backlash. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to give you 3 arguments in this debate. The first is why we shouldn't punish our member just because they want to do something that they like. Secondly, how this will create, how this will represent your movement, and thirdly, how what this discussion, ladies and gentlemen. So first, we need to actually acknowledge that just because you're a part of the movement or of the progressive movement, that shouldn't mean it shouldn't mean that you should be banned from doing something that you don't want. Just because you're, let's say, part of the LGBTQ community, who would more likely aren't a lot of people who in that community join like military, you shouldn't join that. Because in the government of the house, what they will do is that they will only punish the member for being a part of that movement. They won't if you don't support this member, or if you don't support the people or anything that they want, it's just more likely telling you the narrative that you have to choose between like wanting to be part of a movement or wanting to be something like quote unquote the enemy, instead of actually giving them like a driving force of like to do good or to share their opinion in their in their side of the house, right? So ladies and gentlemen, movement to masculine argument is that this going to bring like a representation of this going to represent the movement, because what happened in our side of the house is that a lot of let's say like a lot of movement cannot join this type of institution. Like for example, I already told you like not many people are in the LGBTQ in the LGBT community, aren't a part of military, or like or people LGBT community aren't a lot of them in the Republican Party, right? Therefore, if we say in our side of the house, if we're inside or if we're inside of that particular institution, we're actually going to create changes, right? Because not only that, but we're going to break the barrier, which is what as a progressive movement is our one of our interests, right? We want to break the barrier. We actually want to change the status quo right now, and that can only happen if we actually wanting to engage with them. If we if we want to go to inside and actually create discussion, which is movement to my like their argument that we say in our side of the house, more likely that a discussion will happen in our side of the house more likely, because since now I'm inside the institution, is that what I'm going to do as a member of progressive movement is that all of this I'm going to talk about my issues and why like as a marginalized people I'm joining this movement and telling people on how to support them and etc. Right? And we say that discussion can only happen if we engage to them. Discussion can only happen if we see like their point of view and wanting
On that point,
no thank you, and wanted to engage with the this institutions, right? And we're not literally talking about the people who don't want to engage with us. We're talking about people in the gray area, because we already told you, not everybody in the institution is actually like conservative and etc. And also, we say that a discussion will actually lead to acknowledgement in that. Let's say like my movement exists. Like now, let's say if the member of LGBT community actually join military, now the military know that this movement is actually very big, because that a member of LGBTQ actually will tell the stories or tell how big the movement is and why people should support them, right? And also, like what characterizes to you that on progressive institution is have a very high standings is that they're the policy making. Like for example, like policemen, they're actually the one who protect the people and etc. Right? They're the one who have a high power in creating something, right? And so the discussion is important, because if we actually want to protect our members, if we actually want to protect people that we care or like our movement, we actually need we need to engage with them, right? Because what happened in our side is that discussion will lead to engagement, actually lead to change. What happened is that in their side is that they would neglect the concept of people, and this means that saying that like this type of movement is only is only progressive to people who are actually joining the movement, who people are actually in this side, and people who are outside cannot support them. That's why so proud of us.
All right, thank you, Leader of Opposition. DPM, you're next.
Oh, Matt, may I go to the toilet for 1 minute? Minute aja. It's okay.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. Am I audible? Hello, hello.
Yes.
Okay, just let me fix my people for 1 sec. I'm gonna start. If you guys want to POI, just unmute yourself and just POI me. Yeah. So I'm going to start my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Adjudicators, I'm really confused with the exclusivity that happens to the case of opposition themselves, right? Because if you want to engage to people, I question why engagement is something that's so exclusive that happens on your side only, right? Because in status quo, you still have things like open discussion on the roads, for example, or you can do protests, or the fact that you can just, do that in campaigns, for example. You can talk in news and so on and so forth. That's also a good way for you to actually engage to a whole bunch of audience without inherently engaging towards these people to begin with in the end of the day, right? Because understand that knowing that the comparative that discussions happen on both sides, what's going to happen in opposition? Most likely you'll be forced to be quiet because you're going to be forced to align your views with these kinds of people, most likely, right? The fact that you're in LGBTQ and you want gay marriage, for example, but you'll be forced to compromise those kinds of values in between it when you are entering those kinds of movement because of peer pressure, because you want to gain electability and so on and so forth. Right? You see, that's a harm that they have to take. That's a harm that they never engage to on our side of the house. So I'm going to talk about two things. Number one, I'm going to extend Naufal's argument why in principle it's not justified to celebrate our members entering. But number two, I'm going to talk about practicality, once more engaging to the entire case in regards to representation and breaking the barrier and so on and so forth. But first argument, I'm going to talk about why in principle it's not justified for us to celebrate entering this institution. Because we agree with everything that they say, right? We want as progressive movements, we want equality, we want protection to our members, right? But that's why we do protests and marches against these kinds of institutions to begin with, right? Naufal explained to you in regards to setting back the movement. I'm going to tell to you about why, in principle, even if the outcome does actually lead to several things, it's not going to be something that's significant to begin with. Understand that these anti-progressive institutions are built inherently to oppose our kinds of ideas, right? You have to understand, for example, in opposition side of the house, black people entering the police force the police was an institution built to uphold the rule of slave masters in the end of the day, for example, right? Or even how in status quo we are still being oppressed, like what Naufal says to begin with. But what does this mean? This means that most likely the people who are going to enter this kind of institution, the police force, will be forced, for example, to sacrifice their needs of loving their brother and sister who are also, for example, members of the black community, because most likely you'll be forced to accumulate their values to begin with, right, for example. But understand that in anti-progressive parties, for example, like Republicans or PKS, this is when Naufal's entire argument becomes important, because they never really engage to you as to why, for example, it's justified for us to enter this kind of institution, right? Understand that these kinds of parties are the one that tries to systematically attack and disenfranchise our ways in a heavy way, for example, right? Exactly why Naufal explained about gerrymandering, attacks on the streets, or even the perpetuation of identity politics is something that marginalizes our people, even to the extent of discrimination. That's why, for example, if opposition wants to claim that these people are poor, that's why they enter the police force in the end of the day, we see that that's something that's even bad, because most likely these kinds of political parties, for example, that are at fault for making you systematically poor in the end of the day, for example, to begin with, right? Because these people are the one that's attacking you even from the inside, even from outside, for example, right? They're the one that makes your voice doesn't count due to gerrymandering in the end of the day, for example, right? We see that's a harm that they need to engage to, that's a harm that they need to take to begin with, right? What is this, right? This principal argument is basically explains to you that in between and in disregard of any kinds of analysis, we say that the interest of progressive movements has always been something that's oppositional towards what these people want. Most likely, these kinds of progressive movements are the ones that are anti to our movement to begin with. In fact, they don't even see us, for example, as humans, for example, right? For the most disenfranchised community like LGBTQ, for example, right? Those are the types of policies that they want to be against, for example. We say that's a harm that they need to engage to begin with. But second argument, let's engage the practicality, right? Why the world will be better in government. This is when Naufal's entire preemptive becomes important in tackling down OO, right? Because the practicality that they want in regards to reform inside of their parties wouldn't be likely to manifest. Because number one, Naufal explained to you that most likely this anti-progressive institution would already be too conservative to change. Why is this? Because A, most likely religious parties like PKS or Republicans that are inherently conservative are already baseline and indoctrinated since they were young to follow a certain kinds of values. What does this mean? They'll be anti-abortion, for example. They'll be anti like LGBTQ movements in the end of the day, for example, not allowing us to marry and so on and so forth. But number two, for example, police will be most likely indoctrinated also. You'll be forced to defend our country, for example. You'll be forced to do, systematic attack to your brothers and sisters simply because you need foods and jobs to begin with, in the end of the day. But number two, most likely these parties are most likely also pandering to a conservative base, same as them. Most likely due to this is what causes a power imbalance if you enter this party. Because most likely what's going to happen is that the moment once you enter this party, these people are going to say that your voice doesn't matter simply because the policies that you want and the policies that they want is different, for example. Or even worse, most likely you're going to be the one that compromises your value to be entrenched to this party. This is why many black Republican told to you that Trump is not a racist when he's been actively, systematically doing policies that are anti-blacks to begin with, right? This is exactly what's going to destroy opposition's argument, because the characterization of gray people in the area is that these kinds of gray people will be swayed by the bigger power inside that institution. Just because you're 10 black people entering the Republican Party, you're not going to be heard because there are like hundreds or thousands or even millions of majority who are against you to begin with, right? We say that in your side of the house, changes wouldn't most likely to happen. But number two, in opposition, our people in the minorities will be most likely to be, attacked, because most likely on this side of the house, you'll be said that you don't matter to begin with, right? But let's engage to a much more personal level. Why is it in opposition, it's still going to be bad? Because most likely, number one, I've already explained to you that they'll be discriminated by the majority, that most likely these black people are going to be used as a token, for example, by these kinds of people to promote their conservative values. These people like Republicans saying that, oh, these people are black, but they're still voting for Trump. So all black people should vote for Trump to begin with, right? Which actively hampers our attempt to campaign against them to begin with, right? But number two, in a personal level, there'll be a mental struggle for these people who enter this institution, because they're going to have an identity crisis, like what opposition said. Because most likely these kinds of people will be forced to attack their brother and sisters who are black also. They'll be forced to disregard their identity as a black person to begin with, right? The comparative in government is simpler. Will be more solidified. This is what Nova explained to you. Because we don't compromise. In opposition, we would have to compromise because we still have the stakeholders that we care about. In government, we could campaign more effectively, stating that in opposition, we have people who are we against. These institutions are the ones that are our common enemy to begin with, right? We say that on government side of the house, you can still do reforms to voting for democratic parties or progressive parties that support you, for example. This is how Joe Biden won the 2020 election, right? Those are the types of reform that we want. In principle or practical, we are for this motion. Never been prouder to propose.
All right, DLO, you're up next.
If you guys want to POI me, just do it through chat. I'm going to say it and I'm gonna decide if I'm gonna take it or not. I think we need to understand the context in which this debate plays out, right? Within the current status quo, we have to understand that this kind of institutions, like very anti-progressive, this kind of institutions, especially face a lot of backlash to begin with. But second, we think progressive movement is exactly gaining its sympathy from the people, that people are actually uniting. For example, regardless their race or regardless their gender, to fight for this kind of particular cause to begin with, right? We think this the momentum that we should take to take over this kind of institution by encouraging our members to exactly fill this kind of institutions to begin with, right? We are okay with that. But let's engage to their case, right? Because they actually brought to you a lot of points. For example, like this kind of these kind of institutions exactly create this enfranchisement towards this movement. That two, there is no gonna be like internal reform, and three, it's going to happen what will happen exactly like conflict of interest that lead to why internal reform will not happen, right? Let's engage to this case. First, they're saying that basically what they're actually portraying to us exactly is like the contextualization only, right? That this kind of institutions always create this enfranchisement towards the people. Then they're saying what they're saying is that they're gonna engage to this kind of particular thing by doing campaign to begin with. we think campaign doesn't work, right? Because if exactly campaign works, we think we're going to take over this kind of, we're not going to have this debate to begin with, right? Exactly why? Because what we're saying is that campaign never worked to begin with. Exactly what we need to do is we need to choose for internal struggle to begin with. We're okay with this bullet. We are okay with taking this bullet, saying that it's going to be hard. It's going to hard to create changes to begin with. But Alia explanation regarding engaging to the this kind of particular people in gray area within the constitutions become matters, right? We think this kind of people and exactly don't stand in on the extreme polar of the spectrum, right? Most likely there are moderate Muslim to begin with, or people who don't really care about harming black people. Mostly they're only within the institution to do their job to begin with. We're not gonna see in a very antagonizing point of view, seeing that these people are always going to harm this kind of progressive movement to begin with. Exactly in the inside of the house, when these kind of people always see this kind of institutions as evil to begin with, exactly that is what hampers engagement towards this kind of movement to begin with, right? We think this kind of engagement is particularly important. One, we think exactly why this proves how, for example, this kind of progressive movement is exactly putting efforts to actually change this kind of institutions to begin with. But second, we think it's going to work, right? It's going to at least create discussion or create create the probability of internal changes. Because one, we think the constituent towards this progressive movement is so big to begin with, right? They actually comprise of so many movements. For example, of feminist movement of black people, of other people of colors to begin with, right? I think this is incredibly popular to begin with. So I think in the end of the day, if you're populous and strategic as institution, you would want to pander to this to this kind of support base in the end of the day. But second, we think the backlash that is happening in the status quo severely delegitimize these kind of institutions to begin with, right? What does this mean? This means that these institutions are going to most likely need counter measure to actually show that they're neutral, that they're not as racist as what the people actually portray them to be, right? We think we're okay with this, right? This is why we think this gives certain progressive members a platform to actually have a say within this kind of institution, because they're the one who can pander to this large voter base to begin with, right? So they have to prove to you why the support coming from progressive constituent within a society doesn't matter at all, right? But second, I will exactly prove to you how, for example, this kind of engagement exactly create discussion, right? We think this kind of discussion happens in twofold. First, within the institution itself, right? When these people need this kind of counter view to exactly moderate themselves, in how they appear to the society to begin with. That is how, for example, platform can be given towards these members, because these members are the one who can actually appease the society in large in explaining why, for example, this institution is not so harmful towards the movement in the end of the day. So it's not true when they said that these people are as the member of progressive movement are going to just be shut down in your day, because we don't think that is the case, right? We think what they're portraying to you is not necessarily progressive members at all. If they're choosing to stay silent upon the pressure, right? Because people will know if they're part of LGBT movement or feminist movement and they stay quiet, these people are most likely to face backlashes anyway. This is going to happen in the inside of the house, but not in our side of the house, right? Because in our side of the house, we will always support them and make sure that they have certain kind of backup support in your day. That is why changes happen. But second, we think the second kind of discussion actually happened in the public, right? Which is to say that even the member of progressive movement can enter those kind of in particular institutions, and we think that is good. This encourages more and more of the members to actually join into that kind of particular join and enter those kind of institutions in your day, right? That is to say, representation can happen better in our side of the house when people are more willing to actually engage in this kind of institution, knowing that they have the support of the progressive movement itself. But second, knowing that they have the platform because they are the one who can pander to this kind of like large progressive constituent in the end of the day. But third of all, they have to understand that they are only campaigning and not choosing this internal struggle don't necessarily alleviate the harm, right? What we're saying is that, harm, this kind of harm always happens regardless or not you enter this kind of institution anyway, right? So we think it's okay for us to actually be that kind of force to moderate the polarity or the extreme racism or extreme gerrymandering within this kind of institutions in the of data. So we prove to you several things, right? First, we think within the current context of how, for example, people are not as polar as what they say. People are more willing to support this kind of progressive movements. We think it's our time to actually take this kind of struggle and actually fill this kind of institutions and moderate these institutions, right? This is the worst case that we offer to you. But second, we think with this kind of celebration and support coming from progressive movement, we think we'll have this kind of bigger benefit of actual changes in the end of the day. They have to define why it's not going to happen. So far to oppose.
Right, to open the closing debate, let's call upon the member of government here.
Hello, am I audible?
Can you try again?
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Closing government's belief that if social movements want to succeed, the most important thing to do is to first identify our demands and our agenda. Second is to mobilize our forces. That is to say that we want to have our members under one umbrella. How so? First, by first discouraging progressive individuals to join these traditionally anti-progressive movements, right? But even if they ended up joining these movements, we were not going to call out the individuals, but rather we will call out the institutions instead, because by the end of the day, they are still an important force to our progressive movement, and we do not want to alienate our members. Right now, CJ is going to explain one important thing that is left out in the opening debate. That is why progressive individuals want to join anti-progressive movements in the first place. First, understand that there's not a lot of them to begin with. For example, if you're a feminist and you believe that virginity is socially construction, it is natural for you to not want to join the Indonesian military. That is to say, an institution that wants to have virginity tests for women, right? Why then the answer on why they want to join is they want to join because they seek validations from their families and further from these institutions, right? They want to be seen as strong, as cool. They want to be seen as people who break the stereotypes. We say that validations from these institutions is unjustified because these institutions are oppressive. We say that it is better for them to seek validations by joining more progressive movement. So even though the validation is not that big, it's still in line with their conscience. And by the end of the day, they are not aligning themselves with an inherently repressive institution, right? Now let's extend OG, right? OG has already explained why is it principally unjustified for them to join these movements. But CJ is going to answer why is it principally harmful, something that it's missing from OG's explanation. We say that it's harmful because, as I've stated earlier, traditionally anti-progressive movements are inherently repressive. For example, military are oppressing women by committing heinous acts of rapes and violence against women in war zone. Conservative political parties like PKS are repressive because they are supporting repression towards minority by for example, disbanding churches in Muslim majority areas, right? So we say that it is harmful to begin with. But second, it's going to be tokenistic. We say that it is very dangerous for PKS to have Christian members from East Indonesia and claim that they are a party of diversity, right? Because by the end of the day, these, for example, Christian minority members is going to be seen as trophy member, making them tokenistic. To begin with, they only stand as trophy member. That is to say, they won't be able to stop conservatives to disband churches in these Muslim majority areas. So what does it mean? We say tokenism is very dangerous because it blurs from the root problem, that is injustice, then inequality done by these traditionally anti-progressive movements. Right. Next is I'm going to talk about how we are going to mobilize our forces, right? We say that first, it is important for us to gather our members toward the same concerns and demands manifested in two ways. First, by joining a political party. That is to say, joining a traditionally progressive political parties, and this can happen when the progressive movement is already well established. For example, by joining the Democratic Party in the U.S. or joining the Labour Party in Australia, UK, and New Zealand. But in places like in Indonesia, where it is not possible for them to gather and mobilize under a political party, we say that we can mobilize under grassroots movements. For example, in LSMs and movements like Aksi Kamisan, Kontras, Komnas HAM, and Komnas Perempuan, right? And we're going to challenge the status quo by first in two ways, by either entering the system or challenging them from the outside, right? It's important to note that we are inherently revisionist. We want to always challenge the movement, even if they are not that progressive to begin with. For example, we have we already have a more progressive wing within the Democratic Party with people like Bernie Sanders, AOC, Ilhan Omar, and so on and so forth, right? So by the end of the day, if we do enter these traditionally not so progressive movements, we would still able to mobilize our movement and push our more progressive agendas, right? This is important because contrary to what Olaf stated, social movement is not only a game of who has more masses, but it is also a game on who has more masses, who has a stronger base, right? Now let's talk about what traditionally anti-progressive movement looks like, right? And this point will directly clash with OO's whole case, right? Let's identify and map out, right? First is we have institutions like the law enforcement and military. These institutions adhere to military culture built upon respect. That is to say, you respect the higher ups and built upon direct orders. That means that you can't. That you accept orders from higher up, you cannot challenge them. This leaves no room for discourse and change. Second is the civilian base, right? Conservative parties understand that conservative parties are traditionalists. They want to uphold the tradition. And second, they are paternalistic. You respect the higher ups. You respect people who are already there longer, right? So discourse will not happen under their side of the house. Notice that people in gray area is not a part of the institution to begin with. How can you join the police or military when it's very hard for you to do so, right? When the selection is hard. Most probably, if you want to join the Conservative Party, at best you just sympathize with them and not be a party member. So we say to engage with them, it's best for us to do so by doing it within the grassroots movements and not within these political institutions itself, right? And also understand that the status quo is already progressive enough for us progressive individuals to not join these institutions in which our voices is going to be silenced, right? We say that by the end of the day, it is very important for us to separate from these traditionally anti-progressive movements by first mobilizing our forces towards a common progressive agenda. Why? Because this will make our demands more clearer, and furthermore, we can and by the end of the day, we can furthermore push the debate further to the left instead of co-opting to conservatism like what opening opposition wanted. We have answered why CG has answered why it's going to work both structurally and socially by entering political parties and social movements. Discourse is going to happen better under our side of the house. We are very proud to propose.
All right, opposition member, you're next.
Am I audible?
Loud and clear.
Let me set up my timer and arrange my paper first. I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Let's first engage with the worst case of OG, right? The worst case would be how there will be peer pressure, there will be bullies, where you cannot change where you can change your ideology because of those things when you get into the anti-progressive institution. Firstly, we think the scrutinization exists for the military and also police institution under two scenarios, right? Externally and internally, because we think that there is an intention to be to create progress inside the military and police institution itself, right? What's the external scrutiny? Simple. The external scrutiny are those that we've done, including like demonstration against police brutality and so on and so forth. But what is the internal characterization, the internal scrutiny that also has been done by the institution itself, right? We say that those kind of thing happens under the existence of provost, the existence of internal military court for people that violate their own ethic code. For example, when they becoming racist to someone. Thirdly, on how they now have a police body cam to create less irrational racist act, for example. We say there's this kind of characterization never been brought by any team. Why could there be any scrutiny under the inside the institution itself, right? No taking POI. Thank you. Now, we are going to also explain to you why we actually think that change is possible, because progressive ideology manifests under a spectrum, not a black or white choices, right? We say that why we think it's a spectrum, because when someone is anti-LGBT, it could, but not because there could be someone that is anti-LGBT but not anti-abortion, for example. Or maybe you're a Republican because you're Christian but not anti-global warming or anti-science, for example. So there will be small loopholes wherein people, there are certain ideology that doesn't match with their label, and we think that small changes could only be interrupt or intervene under a personal change that only can be exist under the opposition side of the house, merely under closing opposition, because OO never explained that now. We are going to also engage about CG on how they said that we are not on how they set on their mechanism where they're not going to call out the members, but they're going to call out the institution. Sister, we say that calling out the institution has been done since forever, right? It's not about whether you are going to calling out the member or calling out the institution. If that's what you said, then you have the burden to prove. Why is it justified for you to call out the member and name and shame them to go and enter that place, right? We think that this debate is a debate about whether or not our movement has been progressing or not, because we say that if we're living in a bubble, we are actually creating stagnancy in our own social movement, with further explained under us, right? When they actually also characterize why people enter anti-progressive institution because of validation and prestige, we say that, well, maybe that's true, but there are also other reasons that they fail to characterize, right? There are situations where you cannot actually pay your tuition fee. That's why you go into military forces, for example, because your expenses now can be, subsidized by the institution, for example. We see that there are types of situation in which they don't merely have a choice to begin with, and we think that is not, and we think it's very okay to celebrate them inside that, because it will create changes. It will actually create personal changes under that. Now we are going to actually talk about how we conceive there are two aims under a social movement, right? Firstly, the structural changes on how OG and also CG has talked to you about there is demonstration and so on and so forth. We are either going to confront those people, or we are either going to support them. That's not the choice, Mr. Chair, because we think that there are structural changes already have a mechanism in which people go confront the police, confront the policy, doing protest, demonstration, and campaign on how there are changes of, Joe Biden win the vote, then the structural changes might happen in terms of policy. But secondly, we think that the personal change of people never been addressed until this point, right? This is why progressive people entering the traditionally anti-progressive movement become important and the engagement become exclusive. We say this only happened under closing opposition, never been addressed by opening opposition, right? We say social movement should also address the personal change of people. Because why? Because we see in today's era, progressive people live in a bubble where they have, Namira and Matthew being best friends because they both progressive, for example. Or maybe we live in a family that is progressive. When you talk about anti-abortion is bad, then all of the people besides you will agree to you. When you talk about the feminist movement, then all of the people will agree to you. But we think that living in a bubble itself is a form of stagnancy towards a social movement, right? Why do we think so? Because we never engage personally towards people that are outside our community, right? And by people joining a traditionally anti-progressive institution, it makes you, whether you want it or not, you are going to engage with those people, right? Now, we are going to talk to you about how people change, right? Is it possible to change them? I'm not going to give you a question like, have you ever been homophobic and how did you change, right? We think that change happens under two scenarios. Firstly, exposure. Secondly, genuine understanding, right? You see, when you have an exposure and also genuine understanding, it happens because you see how those people suffer and how those people exposed by their problem. Now, this is exclusive under us. When we are talking about military and police, they have rough trainings. They have tons of trainings. They have, they quote unquote suffer together. Then that is why they have their solidarity as a brother and sister under that institution. Right? We say that solidarity leads to understanding, in which now they can talk to each other about their family problem. They now can talk about each other about their own identity problem, for example. Now there is an understanding inside that, and that's exactly why people would change, right? Because they know your problem, because they know suffer. Because suffering is a universal thing. Like all people in this world suffer in certain ways, and when they heard your story, then there will be the change of their perspective, right? We say that this is very exclusive under us because, when we are talking about structural changes, there is already a mechanism to that. But when it's come to personal changes of those people, never been addressed. And we say that it is really important because if not, then there is a stagnancy in our social movement, right? And we say that this might take years or even more time, but we say that it would be worth it, and we're proudly being the closing opposition. Thank you.
Right. To close the government's case, let's call upon the government whip here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
So for the POI, probably I will not take your POI, but give it a shot. In a chat, if I have a time, I will take your POI. Okay. Okay. I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think to make this debate is clear and why closing government should win this debate, I was trying to answer two main questions in this debate. The first one under the principles level, the second one under the practical level. The principles level will most likely talking about justification why we could doing this or not, and secondly the practical levels on how it is going to be a betterment for our movement in terms of getting memberships or pushing the discourse in our current society. But first of all, we engage toward the opposition bench. The first one toward the opening governments and most probably toward the closing governments. The first one, the opening governments trying to brought the idea that at the end of the day we can change something from from joining the movement from the internal of the structural problems that we face at the stringing of point. And then the closing of opposition trying to expand this by saying there's existing mechanisms, for example, in the military in the military sector when the military court is there. We say, ladies and gentlemen, this kind of study case is really counterproductive and really counterintuitive to our movement since the very first place. First response. Most probably what will happen and already happened in our current status quo is in the military sector, they have the mechanisms that make it tokenistic or make it just to appease raise our voices without necessarily care about the root of the problems. The proof of this is the don't ask, don't tell policy. Because at the end of the day, the don't ask, don't tell policy, embracing the idea of toxic environment that you as an individual having a standard of living and a gender role at the very first place. You cannot accept one individual with one particular identity in order for you to perform better in the military sector at the end of the day. Therefore, we say, even if with the existing mechanisms, it is a toxic mechanisms. But secondly, talking about the seeking validation, but second response, even if in the best case scenario it is a free agency and a choice that being made by the individuals itself, we say the root of the problem of this is the seeking validation that really toxic. Therefore, the point coming from Namira is really important in our debate, because seeking validation through a conservative movement, while you are a progressive individuals, most probably you will be a good apple in a lot of rotten apple. Most probably you are going to be the rotten apple also. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, the implication of this, the self-actualizations of individuals will most likely not going to be there. While the closing opposition is trying to claim that at the end of the day, this individual doesn't have any kind of choice and option in this world, we say it's totally untrue. Why so? Because if you're a progressive individuals, by any means, that means there's ideological differences. The only things that surpass this ideological differences is actually your own ego. Therefore, the self-actualizations maybe can be driving better into certain kind of activists, for example. You cannot going to be there since the very first place. But thirdly, talking about engagement coming from the opening governments and closing governments, we say they are only talking about the participations, even if the closing opposition trying to word it by things that talking about the personal changes, we say it's only in the level of participations. We are talking in the level closing governments is different from the opening governments, because we are talking from the level of quality. We are talking about how we are going to discuss the root of the problems, influence the society, and change the solutions. Namira is already explaining this. The root of the problems cannot be smoke screen, but second, the influence to our constituent need to be really consistent since the very first place. If our member joining the conservative institution that constantly being called out since the day one, that means our movement is already being corrupt since the very first place. For the study case of this is talking about the Black Lives Matter. When the black people when the black police enforcement that actually believe in the BLM itself, having the moral questions coming from the movement itself. While you are trying to stopping the demonstrations, while you are also part of us. But secondly, there's a mental burden coming from these individuals to hold accountable or to stop their own peoples when they are asking and holding the institution accountable. Therefore, our models to only blaming the institution is already enough, and we want to stick to the status quo, and it's already happening. But going to the questions, why it is justified for our movement? Because we are a revisionist movement that is really exclusive in comparison to opening governments. We are wanting to correct the discriminations and challenge the stereotype. Therefore, it is a structural problem happening, because it is a behavior things and repeated actions for a century. And being moderate, it will normalize the group movements, the discriminations and corrupt situations that are already happening in our current situations. So at some point, we cannot be moderate, and we need to be radicals as what the opening opposition and closing oppositions that doesn't want. Why is it important? Because we are the only check and balance systems that currently exist in our social movements. Therefore, we cannot be moderate since the very first place. In the worst case scenario, most probably our movement become uncomfortable. People hating you, questioning your sanity. But just bear this in your mind, panels. It is the prerequisite of having a constant discussions and why our progressive movement could be exist since the very first place. Therefore, we are never going to be appealed toward the majority because it is not our constituent and it is not stagnant because we have a constant discourse. But in the best case scenario, most probably they will gain more support by catering toward the conservative community. The trade-off is more probably tolerating the discrimination value the access in our current movement. For example, the feminist movement talking to the religious institutions, they cannot.
We're going to discuss more on the conservative political parties, which is more ideological to begin with. Let's first start with the military and police force. First things first, we need to consider the fact that military is a career path, right? That it requires a certain set skill to do so. That certain people might be wired inherently to go in the military because they, for example, have the physical capability, have the mental capability of enduring war, for example, right? So we think that this need to be considered from every part of the debate. And secondly, there are some scenarios in which people do not have money, for example, for tuition to go to school, and thus they have to enter military. My point is, there is an internal decision making of realizing that what makes you happy in the long run might be related to the scenario in which people enter military, right? And or even to the extent that you can give back to your community by being a black police in a black rural community, for example, providing protection for black kids doing drugs, for example, and giving their ways not to be caught or being incarcerated, for example, right? We think that these externalities exist in a personal realm that matters to people's sense of livelihood. The moment when a movement is framed as something that requires you to sacrifice the possibility of your survival will only make people first disappointed by the movement because it requires me to do so much for them, and secondly threatens them, right? Which creates internal friction. This is exactly what is going on the leftist side, for example. They try to bring up this point of like, let's just eat the rich, for example, let's revolt and let's try to bring out the guillotine, for example. But the question becomes, what happens next? What happened to my kids, for example, if we really do that kind of riot, if we really do go in a chaos, right? We think the moment when you portray our progressive movement in a way that it threatens you so much, it is going to be counterproductive under our side. What we are going to concede is that there are always going to be activists, there's always going to be academia, for example, who define their life as meaningful when they pursue for this kind of progressive movement, right? So we think that it's definitely fine for you to be moderate because there are always going to be people who is going to defend the ideals. But then we need to talk about the praxis because the praxis matters, right? So let's move on to the second scenario on a more ideological standpoint of conservative political parties. We think that political ideology exists in a spectrum. Even progressive agenda manifests in a lot of ways. For example, anti-gun law or LGBTQIA or anti-abortion. Your stance in the political ideology could manifest in a lot of ways. For example, if you come up from a Christian background, which requires you to be, for example, anti-abortion, doesn't necessarily mean that you do not support, for example, anti-gun law. We think that we need an internal discussions even in the conservative party because then the decision making internally need progressivity inside the chamber, right? We think that, for example, there is a discussion on whether or not Ben Shapiro is being counterproductive for the conservative party, for example, because he's being that douchey of someone who doesn't really represent the ideals of the conservative value, right? So we think that it is a shot worth taking. So let's look at the roadmap of how actually this is going to progress our movement as a whole. We think that there are 2 points of view. First, on the externalities, and secondly, on the internal change. First, we think that on the external point, there is think tank, which, for example, creates dissertations of the ideals and make, for example, and pander to the leftist people, for example. But we think that it is exclusively going to be happening under the leftist people, for example, because people in the very first place care about that thing, right? So they can always push for reform of activism. But we think that this is not happening in a more conservative scenario, for example. We think that, for example, if you come up with in a white middle upper class suburban life, for example, there is simply no way for you to have any access for black people, for example. So the racial issue feels far. So there's gonna be no incentive for you to actually care about the issue in the first place, right? And secondly, about internal change, we think that their characterization is not that nuanced because they simply say, well, this is a traditionally anti-progressive institution. We think that it is, even if it is traditionally anti-progressive, we think that it is progressive because there is a myth, the myth of the good government is changing. People scrutinize U.S. military intervention in the Middle East, even if they're relatively conservative, right? And there are intentions for no, thank you. Internal reform. Why do you think that this is important? First, there's always gonna be a minority even in this kind of institution. Even in the military, we're gonna still have trans men entering that, right? So we need an internal safety net. Their burden is to prove to you why there is no necessity for that internal safety net in which when trans people enter the military, for example, they can still find friends to relate to their struggles, for example, right? And we think this will manifest in internal protocol changes. Look at how the police force now have body camera to accommodate people, for example, during their police duty, and thus you can see if they do if they discriminate against black people, for example. So we think there is always going to be an incentive because they have those kind of people inside their institution, right? And simply, we think we're going to justify the pragmatic reasoning. For example, if you are a conservative people living in a relatively conservative neighborhood, and thus it's better for you to go with the conservative party, for example, to have a better chance in a political seat. We think that the internal decision making is necessary to defend in the first place. So let's think about the last point on personal changes. First, Renan told you about exposure, right? Because well, opening never really told you the roadmap of this personal changes, but we told you exposure is justified and is necessary. Even if the worst case scenario is that you are being tokenized, for example, there are always going to be tokenistic behavior. We're gonna take that ballot because even if it is not the most progressive stance you can take, this is the first step towards that, right? Why so? Because first, then you make them realize that this is your reality, this is someone who is near you, and this is very close to you. But secondly, it gives you the incentive of making them respect you by your competency. Exactly because you are being a representation of a whole minority group. The moment when you prove to them that you are worthy of their attention and you are worthy of their respect, for example, by being a competent military member, it is the moment when you have represented the whole movement and represented the whole community. And that is the internal changes that we want to push. This is why we're very proud to be closing opposition. Thank you.
Here, here.
All right, thank you, everyone. We are going to announce the result in the main room, so you can leave the breaking room, and judges can